Go ahead, Larry.
Okay, are you seeing this?
No.
Weird. Let me see why. It worked this morning.
Try now. Okay, Larry, it's on.
Great. And do you have a full screen of it?
Yes, I do. Is this everybody
Wonderful.
else? Looks like they do.
Okay. So there are a lot of Leave the Leaves programs. Cersei's offers them. I think NOFA does one. A number of the groups do them. And most of them tend to be pretty technical about what to cut and when and how high the stems should be and what you might do with leaves other than putting them in trash bags out front of your house. And what I've been doing this fall is really talking about the reasons behind why we need to leave the leaves and rethink how we manage our not only our gardens but our lawns and our properties in general, from the tree belts in the front of our houses to our backyards. And I hope it's more talking to people's hearts and not so much their heads about just the mechanics of it. It's always helpful for me to take a broader perspective. And I talked about that a little bit in the spring when I talked with you all about what to plant for spring and summer gardens to support pollinators, because they ultimately are the critical food source, most critical food source for birds, for baby birds. So with that in mind, the goals for this evening will be to help you understand why we do with our yards and gardens, or what we do, why that's in the fall and winter, why it's so critical in supporting both the overwintering insects and why it becomes critical for birds, particularly in the spring. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about to show you some of the tiny wildlife that overwinter in our gardens. A lot of people don't know what happens to our native insects, particularly pollinators, in the fall and winter. And I'll touch on, I mean, we have thousands and thousands of insects that overwinter with us that most of us don't know about. So I'll touch on just a couple of the more familiar ones. But as Janice said, I'll send out, I have an email with a ton of links to YouTube videos and books and websites, and I'll update it after this talk to address any questions you all ask. And I'll send that out to Janice in the morning, and then she can send it out to you. I want to, like I did in the spring and summer, I want to give you a list of native plants and seeds that you can add to your gardens now before the ground freezes. That will come up in the spring and will be, they'll go through, if you plant them now, they'll go through, particularly the seeds will go through their regular cold cycle. So it's a great time to plant them. And then, like I said, to provide you with a list of resources for you to turn to, particularly during the winter months when you're done with the seed catalog and you have other questions and you're ready to learn more. And as always, I just hope to inspire people to be more hands-on in their gardens and to really think about the impact that they have on, for you all, particularly birds, but the insects that those birds absolutely depend on. Fall's arrival, these are all current shots from the last couple of weeks. Fall's arrival has really different meanings for humans. This is, if you hear a little dog shaking, that's my dog Emmy right there. She was out the other day in the backyard and it was chilly enough that she needs a fleece on. We have had frost, a couple of minor frosts at the Northampton Community Garden. So some of the Rudbeckia that were left have died back, the Tithonia, and there still are a couple of stray monarchs up there. But I think what humans see when we see fall coming is that, we're sort of getting ready for winter, but we ultimately think about what the impact will be in our gardens and our lawns, and the kind of work that we have to do to move that garden forward. Really different response to fall's arrival than for insects and wildlife. Bees are beginning to slow down, although in these last warm days, you'll see them buzzing around trying to get as much pollen and nectar as they can. The bottom center photo is praying mantis, which is not a native insect, but the praying mantis are setting their egg cases. You can see monarchs on Totarian aster at the bottom left. Those are some of the last asters that will be blooming, although the regular asters came out late and they're actually still in bloom right now. And for the most part, it's monarchs that are left for butterflies that are in the garden. The hawks are showing up. The Northampton Community Garden has a number of red tails every year. And I saw a Cooper's hawk the other day. So the hawks are very happy when there are fewer gardeners and the ground is covered and they can get voles and moles and chipmunks. So they're very happy to be in the garden. The amphibians, the toads and frogs are beginning to think about going dormant for the winter. I had a garter snake in my little vegetable garden here at the house the other day that was sunning, and I thought it might be dead. It didn't move, but I think when I was near it, but I think it just wanted to be in the sun. So wildlife has a really different response to the fall, to fall's arrival: cooler temperatures, fewer hours of daylight. And we need to keep that in consideration when we're working in our gardens and in our lawns. Inevitably, this is the massive old ginkgo, 125-year-old ginkgo tree at Smith College's Botanic Garden. One day, a couple of years ago, its leaves have dropped green for the past couple of years, but a few years ago, or actually 3 years ago, ginkgos generally, all the leaves turn at once and drop. And I know most of the gardeners at Smith, and like all of us eyeballing our backyards right now, the first thing we think about as humans with the leaf drop is it's time for fall cleaning. But for native wildlife, fall's arrival, as I was saying, is more nuanced. These are Canadian geese who stop. That's actually Paradise Pond, and with the reflections of the leaves turning, they stop here every fall and every spring. While some, both birds and insects, migrate right now, and again, these are all local and from this year and last. Others stay, and that's really what we'll talk about tonight. The birds that stay generally are in the form as mature adults, but the insects, particularly butterflies and moths, are not. They are in a dormant chrysalis state. And it's those chrysalis that are often in our gardens, in our yards, in leaf litter, and that get destroyed or damaged in some way when we are doing our quote unquote fall cleanup. A lot of people ask, as I'm doing talks, what do pollinating insects forage on in the fall, and where do they go in the winter? And these shots of gardens will give you some example. The upper left-hand shot is actually Peggy Besh's garden at the community garden a couple of weeks ago. And all the gardens change, so what the insects are foraging on changes as well. There are tons of birds, as we said, in the garden. There still are, there's still lots of other wildlife there, and everything shifts what it's eating as they're stocking up on food to allow them to be dormant for the winter. The monarchs, there still are monarchs. They will migrate. They won't spend the winter, but everything else is feeding on what's left. For birds separate than feeding on moth and butterfly caterpillars in the spring, you can see a lot of the seed heads that are here on the bottom left is Anise hyssop, whose seeds are really beautiful when they're covered with frost and sort of sparkling with those beautiful crystals. But the birds love them as well. The bottom right is sumac. It's a row of sumac. That's actually I took it in Hadley, and it's filled with a flock of starlings. It was pretty amazing to watch. But I've been really impressed with sumac. At the garden, we don't allow trees because they just are problematic with shade and roots. But I've been looking at sumac for the past couple of years, particularly the staghorn sumac, and what an amazing winter food source it is. I've seen everything from starlings to robins to bluebirds on it in the middle of really bitter January mornings along the Connecticut River. So it's a really wonderful thing to be able to keep. The bottom, that brilliant red, is Virginia creeper, and it is a host plant. And it's important to remember that from an aesthetic perspective, it's a really gorgeous red to have in our gardens, but it's also a host plant to a couple of different butterfly and moth species. So those are important to get to know. And as you begin to clean up, or as we begin to clean up our gardens, to remember to allow those things to be in place for as long as they can be. Last weekend, we did a pop-up pruning party at the garden to sort of manage. We have a lot of invasive, not really invasive, but non-native mulberry trees that can be problematic. And so we were literally cutting down mulberry branches, but cutting around Virginia creeper, which won't really harm the trees, to allow them to be in place, both for their color and so that we wouldn't take a potential chrysalis source, nesting source for the butterflies and moths that require them. So what I talked with you about in the spring and early summer was thinking about year-round gardens for pollinators, and I'll come around again to why those are important, so important, absolutely critical for birds, particularly baby birds. You can see these are, top left is Monarda fistulosa, which is our native bee balm in the spring. Verbena bonariensis, there are two shots there on the top. Verbena bonariensis is actually not a native plant, but the butterflies love it. Tom Gagnon, who is part of your group, really, I think, is one of the main reasons so many of us have Verbena bonariensis in our plots. Other than that, the seeds below, they're just, when he plants he's had 4 plots at the garden for almost 20 years, and generally plants every single seedling by hand. And it's just a stunning display that's always filled with butterflies and birds. And as long as they're clean and non-pesticide treated when we plant them, I think they're really aesthetically a really beautiful addition to our gardens. And I've seen absolutely everything in there, from tiny, tiny little skippers to hummingbirds to larger birds, and certainly all the butterflies. Lower left is Tatarian aster, which is also not a native aster, but it's the latest blooming aster that I'm aware of here. You'll find some at the Smith Botanic Garden. You'll find a lot of it at the Northampton Community Garden. A couple of people bought plants from Smith years ago, and now there's one plot, 20 by 20 plot, that is just solid Tatarian aster, and they're always filled with bees and butterflies right now at this time of the year. Trees and shrubs are also really important. I'll talk about that at the end. For sources, you can see in the center chokecherry and some of the other winterberry bushes that are along the tiny pond, Little Lyman Pond at Smith Botanic Garden. That's where this picture is taken of the robin a couple of winters ago. Brutal cold weather, and birds are eating the berries, which many of them have these really complex and really interesting relationships with cold. And some of them, the berries are too tart and don't have the right nutrient chemistry until they've been frozen and thawed a couple of times. And then the birds eat them. So it gives them critical amounts of sugars and carbohydrates, and for them to make it through the winter. And then the bottom right is one of my plots at the community garden. We changed the rules several years ago to be more in line what we know now, the way gardens should be prepared to go through the winter for as much as we prepare them. We allow now gardeners to remove just vegetable plants that would otherwise might bring in some kind of parasite or virus. Native plants can stay. They have to be within a plot, and not growing out the edges. Most of us cut them down to about shoulder height, but we allow pithy stemmed plants to be in place so that bees and other creatures that you might use them for overwintering eggs can use them. It's also almost impossible to tell when there are butterfly chrysalis on them, so it's just better to leave them in place. And I'll show you again some of the particularly swallowtail is probably our most well-known overwintering butterfly, and I'll show you what their chrysalis looks like. So this slide really gives you the idea of how we need to plan for really 4 seasons, year-round gardens for pollinators. Another thing to remember, I talked about this a lot last time, is that absolutely everything is connected. And as humans, we need to really wrap our heads around that right now. We seem to think that we can do things in the world and we have no impact, or somehow we're not connected to wildlife. And yet, I just saw that the king crab fishing season was canceled because they somehow, more than 1 billion king crabs around Alaska and the Bering Strait are gone. Overfishing, warming temperatures, not sure. But everything that we do in our gardens, when we get to this time of the year and we say, where do the pollinating insects go? What do birds eat? It really depends on us. It really depends what we will allow to be in place for them so that they can stay on their primary natural diet. So we need to understand that everything is connected. One of the things I was talking with you all about last time, and I'll show you that slide again, which is, I think, the only slide that sometimes I want to put in a presentation. The baby birds that are here also in the Northampton Community Garden, I forget what they were, but the fact that just one clutch of chickadees needs between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars from the time they hatch until the time they fledge, which is just a mind-boggling statistic. And those caterpillars are primarily our native butterflies and our native moths. And so you begin to see the connection really quickly as people who love birds, why we need to support having native pollinators, particularly butterflies and moths, and also bees, because bees do provide more of the ecological services of pollination than any other insect. We could actually, as humans, for the most part, we would have food without butterflies. It would be challenging for us to have produce without bees. And again, everything is connected. These are all photographs from the Northampton Community Garden. You know, the hawks, the praying mantis, the giant swallowtails, the tree swallows, and the clearwing moths all have an intricate dance in the food that they eat and the food that they become to all the creatures that are in the garden. We had a sort of another pop-up class a couple of weeks ago. It's been a concern of mine that the garden is losing some of its biodiversity because we have a lot more people growing food there. We're certainly not going to say don't grow food, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to sort of bring back a small scale version of the proverbial hedgerows that that farmers used to have around their fields, and that were so critical for pollinating insects and also birds, but particularly providing things like milkweed. And with chemicals, with glyphosate, with things that allowed farmers to cut down more of those edges or knock down more of those edge plants. That's part of the fragmentation that we talk about that is threatening both insects and birds, because those areas are not there. And so we talked about at the community garden is can we create sort of minor little area edges to our gardens where no one gardener has to give up any space, but if they would plant the native plants that we know are host plants in those areas. It's amazing to think 6.5 acres and with 415 plots, the impact that we could have in terms of creating sort of pollinator habitat and pollinator pathways. And I think all of us need to think about that and doing that, carrying that idea in our home gardens and our home lawns. So to bring it back for numbers in terms of butterfly, the role that butterflies, moths, and bees play in our gardens and for birds, we have about 825 native butterflies and a mind-boggling number of about 12,000 species of moths in North America. Most of our butterflies, native butterflies, overwinter in chrysalis on stems, although some overwinter as mature butterflies in bark crevices in between shingles and our homes. Every single butterfly has its own story. And I mean, I think it's, maybe you all would spend the winter reading more about birds. I probably would read more about butterflies, but it's fascinating to begin to know where they overwinter and how they overwinter and how they make it through what their life cycle is. This is a life cycle of black swallowtail butterfly. The important thing to remember for butterflies, I get people all the time when I do talks, not really disputing why I'm talking about planting native plants, but inevitably someone will say, well, I have, whatever kind of flowers in my garden, and I have tons of butterflies feeding on them. That's true. And there's a mature black swallowtail here foraging on buddleia. But the issue is not the mature butterflies or mature moths. The issue at hand is where the tiny little caterpillars go, because 90% of our plants are co-evolved so that they have specific relationships with insects. So almost everybody knows about monarchs and the fact that monarch caterpillars can only feed on milkweed plants. There are several species of milkweed and they're different around the country depending on what's native. Mature monarchs, you will see them, I have tons of shots I showed you before on Verbena bonariensis and asters. Anything that's flowering right now, they're working on gathering nectar and pollen so they have energy. But if those little caterpillars, if the eggs are laid on a plant that is not in the milkweed family, when the egg hatches, the caterpillar will die. The same is true of all the swallowtails that we have here. And I think there are 6 or 7 native species of swallowtail here in this part of New England. And they all pretty much follow this life cycle that's here. The mature butterfly lays an egg, the egg hatches, the caterpillar eats its way through whatever leaf or plant it's on, that it gets to a certain point. I think there are 5 instars, and that instar, last instar, crawls away and goes into chrysalis. It's really, really interesting here in Northampton, not far from Smith College, and I have a little backyard vegetable garden. And I planted 4 dill plants. I got no dill all summer, but I had 4 waves of black swallowtails. And I watched one of them, I watched this caterpillar throughout the week that it ate its way through an entire dill plant. And then I actually watched and videoed it crawling, not where I thought it would go. It crawled through a mesh fence that I have across my neighbor's lawn on a searing hot day. Dry, crawled across the grass and onto, I think it was a blue lobelia, where it went into chrysalis. Took it about half an hour, and I watched the entire thing. I don't know why it went there. I don't know what drew it to it. In the end, a robin actually ate it. There was a robin's nest above it, but just what these little things go through to get to chrysalis, to complete the life cycle, its life cycle, is really mind-boggling and also fascinating. These are different swallowtail caterpillars. On the upper left is one that we rarely see. It's actually at Smith. It's a pipevine swallowtail caterpillar, which is on Dutchman's pipevine. In the center is a giant swallowtail on rudigraviolens. On the right is a black swallowtail on parsley. And the center at the bottom is a spicebush swallowtail, which can pupate on both spicebush and also this is sassafras. So these are what their caterpillars look like. They're absolutely specific to the plants that they're on. But when they go into chrysalis, this is what it looks like, or what they look like. So you can see in the center, there are two different instars of a black swallowtail, and then underneath it, what it looks like when it goes into chrysalis. Most of them take on the color of the stem that they attach themselves to. And then some of them show a little bit of green if the stems are still green, but then almost inevitably become brown. The really interesting thing about the end season butterflies that I find really fascinating, the monarchs, for example, all the monarchs, we're lucky now if we get 2 generations, maybe 3 of monarchs, but the first 2 generations will hatch. They'll eat, they'll feed, the goal is to lay eggs and to keep reproducing. The last generation of monarchs, when they eclose from chrysalis, they make no attempt to mate, they eat as much as they can, and then they begin the migration south. With swallowtails, it's the same kind of thing, except that the very last generation will stay in chrysalis until the spring. And it's fascinating to think how they know how to do that. But right now there are just thousands and thousands of swallowtail chrysalis dormant for the winter, and they'll come out in the spring when the light is at a certain level and the temperatures are at hit a certain level. Moths are really, really fascinating, and there aren't as many studies about moths because they're smaller. We don't see them as much. This is a clearwing moth on Robina bonariensis, but a lot of the moths, the sphinx moths in particular, some that we love to hate, the tomato hawk moths or the tobacco moths, actually overwinter as kind of a really almost a cross between a caterpillar and a chrysalis, and they're underground, which is really fascinating. And they're not that far underground, maybe an inch. And so when we're cleaning up or even raking leaves, we inevitably dig them up and they go into trash bags and end up on a dump somewhere. Some people burn leaves, or they go into compost. So what we do with our gardens is equally impactful on moths in ways that most of us probably don't consider. Bees, we have about 4,000 native bees in all of North America. 70% of our native bees are ground nesting, including bumblebees. When we talk about bees, most people think about honeybees. Honeybees are not native. They've been here for about 400 years. They were brought over from Europe. And yes, honeybees have had issues with colony collapse disorder and parasites, but depending on who you talk to, for the most part, there seems to be agreement now that honeybees are not endangered. But our native bees are, yes, ground dwelling, but they're also singular. They're solitary. Many of them can't sting. Many of them are tiny, and there's not a lot of research that's been done on them because they're really difficult to follow. It's hard to find their nest. It's hard to study them. We have a couple of great professors that I always mention, Glenn Adler at UMass Amherst and Rob Jagir at UMass Dartmouth, each studying native bumblebees. Bumblebees are easier to see and easier for us to identify. Interesting thing about bees, bumblebees in particular, is that right now we'll still see bumblebees out and about, but shortly, once the ground freezes and we have a killing frost, every bumblebee in the nest will die. It's just the impregnated queen who will go into dormancy for the winter and who will emerge in the spring, looking to start a new nest. I'm going to talk about plants and what we should be planting to support bumblebees in the spring. But an important thing to consider is where those bumblebees go into dormancy. And so some of them nest in cavities in the ground, around roots, anywhere that they can find a place just to be warm and safe. A project, large urban pollinator habitat that I have in West Springfield for a client. I had a massive problem with voles just decimating native plants, which was really a surprise. And I was trying to think about options. It wasn't an option to just let them go. So I ended up using mouse traps to catch them and then fed them to foxes in the back meadow, hoping that that would keep the life cycle going. But I didn't want to use a rodenticide or any kind of pesticide, because one of the things that, one of the places that bumblebees use, queen bumblebees use, both for nests and also to spend the winter, are abandoned rodent holes. And so I wanted to make sure that those holes were as safe as they could be, even if it meant losing some plants. And all of us really need to think about that when we're yes, dealing with sort of varmints in the garden, in our gardens. And you know, at the Northampton Community Garden, we certainly have voles and moles and chipmunks and just about everything else. But what ways can we work to make sure that, yes, if we want to trap them or do something to remove them, keep encouraging more hawks to show up, but how can we do it in a safe way that doesn't create sort of a death cycle all the way down the line?
Hey, Larry, just to interrupt, we have a question here from Donna. What are the names of the UMass professors you mentioned that you're doing research on bees? Do you have any information on that?
Yes, Lynn Adler is at UMass Amherst. You can look her up. She's won, I think she's on a second pretty substantial grant. She got a grant, I think, last year. And Lynn is studying pollination systems, but she has in particular been looking at a chemical that is in the pollen of sunflowers, native sunflowers. And again, I'm oversimplifying this, but she's looking for, and there seems to be a correlation between that pollen and the ability of bumblebees to have the chemical that's in there boost their immune systems. Rob Jagir, Dr. Jagir is at the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth, and Rob speaks a lot up here. We actually have 2 plots at the community garden that are a research project for him that some of us collect citizen scientist data and send it to him. And that's also from a National Science Foundation grant he paid to put the plants in there. And what Rob looks at too, talks more and more about pollination systems, but Rob's breakdown of our native bumblebees are, I think we had 11 initially, we have 7 now, and breaks them down. It's really interesting to listen to him or to work with him. They're short-term, medium-tongue, and long-tongued bumblebees, and each of them is adapted to particular plants with flowers that have particular shapes that make it unique for them to be able to get pollen and nectar from those plants. So Rob studies more of sort of the morphology of those bumblebees. He's looking for ways that we can support them, and we can support the bumblebees that are endangered. And kind of the good news, bad news complexity of it all is that the bumblebee that most of us see the most frequently is called Bombus impatiens. Bombus impatiens is thriving. The plants, it's a medium-tongued bumblebee, and the plants that it feeds on are numerous. And so Rob's looking at why are they thriving? There's another one called Bombus fervidus, which is the golden northern bumblebee, which will most likely be the next on the endangered species list. On this slide, the Bombus fervidus is in the top center photograph. And you can identify it. Its body is primarily yellow all the way down rather than fuzzy black, and it has a black, sort of a black T, a black line between its shoulders. And Bombus fervidus, interestingly, many of us have been finding. We've been finding it at the Northampton Community Garden, and I actually found it on red clover, like you see here, and crown vetch in this crazy urban West Springfield property, and we're not sure why. So maybe they're around and we haven't seen them, but what Dr. Jagir is working on is advising people to what kinds of plants to plant and at what time of the year to support particularly the endangered species or the bumblebees in the mix that are the most endangered. Does that answer the question enough?
Gather, thank you. So it seems it has answered the question. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll send to you a link to Dr. Adler's work and also to Dr. Jagir's work. They're really interesting. Rob in particular has a lot of information. He has a website. He was at WPI before, and he has a website called Beecology. And you can download an app. You can collect data for him as well and submit it so that he can utilize the data in his lab. And so to bring it around for all of you to birds, some birds migrate, some birds stay. These are all local cedar waxwing, short-eared owl, and a robin that have been here. The short-eared owl is over on Cemetery Road in the Honeypot area of Hadley. Robin and cedar waxwing are here just off the Smith College campus. For birds, here's the slide that I showed to you all several months ago. When people say, why are pollinators important to birds? And again, this is from the research of Doug Ptolemy and Desiree Narango, who was Doug's graduate student at the University of Delaware and who actually is still here in doing postdoc work at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. If you can hear Desiree talk, she talks about trees, native trees, the importance of native trees in particular. But her PhD thesis was studying Carolina chickadees in the Washington, D.C. area. And what she and Dr. Ptolemy was her graduate advisor. What they found out was that it takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of chickadees. And so if you multiply that times all the birds, times bigger birds, times all the nests, it's a mind-boggling number of caterpillars that are necessary just to keep our birds in their life cycle and being born and healthy. The importance of native plants, Desiree talks, she gave a talk at UMass, I think 3 years ago. There was a community tree meeting conference mostly for tree wardens. And as a master gardener, we have some overlap with UMass and UMass Extension. And so we are able to sit in on some of the conferences. And the first person to talk at that event was Alex Sherman, who I believe is still the tree warden for the city of Springfield. And Alex is young and had some great ideas and was really excited talking about the fact that he had been experimenting with using tropical trees in Springfield because they were better suited against the warming temperatures, salt, and water inundation. And from a liability perspective from the city, they worked really well, and his talk was well received. Desiree, who none of us realized who it was initially. Many of us knew her name from studying reading Dr. Ptolemy's books and listening to him talk. Desiree got up and talked about, not to refute Alex, but just her research is on native trees. And I'll show you the slide from her in just a little bit about native trees and the fact that none of the tropical trees that Alex wanted to plant in Springfield supported any birds or insects, in terms of having caterpillars be able to eat those leaves. Even the ginkgo tree that I showed you here over at Smith, which is such a fabulous old tree, it's not native. And so I think it supports maybe 3 or 4 species of insect that have evolved so that their caterpillars or their babies' eggs can eat the leaves. Other than that, there's nothing. The most important tree are our oak trees, which support, I think, something around 477 native insects and caterpillars. And I'll show you the list of trees from Desiree's talk in just a second. So I said this before, but just so you have it on the slide, 90% of plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. Almost all of them are specific to native plants. And it's actually the plants, interestingly, it's the plants that have co-evolved to adapt to the butterflies and to the insects. So monarchs, yes, on milkweed, swallowtails. There's the picture, the second picture in there is my arm, and I had run up to the garden to one of my plots to water, and I saw on a hanging from a blade of grass that's a spicebush swallowtail that had closed not long before I got there. Its wings were still droopy and it couldn't fly. And I have a spicebush in that plot, and it's a tiny little spicebush. It's maybe about 4 feet tall, and it actually had 10 spicebush caterpillars on it this summer. I never found any of I always look for chrysalis, never find them. But I went up that morning and there was a absolutely stunning, big, healthy female spicebush swallowtail. And so all of these, all of our butterflies really are co-evolved so that their caterpillars need not just plants, but native plants. And that's why so many of us are talking about the importance of native plants. Yes, we plant other things. Yes, the eastern yellow swallowtail on the far right is foraging on buddleia, butterfly bush, which some people argue about. They're not going to go away, and they thrive on them. Whether it's the best nutrient density for them, not sure, but most likely not. But we will never stop them from feeding on them. So what we need to focus on is planting as many native plants as we can. Dr. Ptolemy talks about doing a 90-10, 90% native plants, 10% other plants. And again, as long as they're clean. So bringing this around to fall, here are late fall food sources for bees and butterflies. You can see again, aster, Tartarian aster for the monarchs, an aster, New England aster, lower right, for a bumblebee. I have the center is really interesting. It was taken at Smith, Tartarian aster, and it's I can't even tell what kind of bumblebee it is. I think it's Bombus impatiens, but the little bumblebees on it they're mating with her, and it was absolutely a fascinating picture to take. Would not have happened if she wasn't there foraging on the late season aster. I think that was late October. And then on the lower left is monkshood, which is a really interesting food source in that it requires something that bumblebees and few other bees can do called buzz pollination. The pollen is inside, the bumblebee has to crawl inside, so it has to be really muscular to be able to get inside. And then the pollen is really tight, and so the bumblebee buzzes creates that movement with its body so it can shake loose the pollen. All of these plants are in bloom now, even though we've had a couple of frosts, and it's important to have them so that they can have food this late in the season, as late as we can possibly keep them. Here's Desiree. This is actually a shot that I took of her in 2019 at UMass. And you can see the slide that she has up there, native trees and the species they support. Oak, 477, our native cherry, 415, willows, which we'll talk about in a little bit, 406 species, birch, 397. And then looking at the non-native trees that were mentioned by Alex and some of the other tree wardens who were experimenting with tropical trees. Clearly, we can't just decide what trees to plant in our cities based on liability alone. We need to come up with some kind of a plan so that we have native trees in place, so that we're supporting the native species of insects, which in turn feed birds, which in turn complete the life cycles of all the wildlife around us. Doug Ptolemy, if you don't know him, I'll send you links to a few of his talks. Really, really interesting. He wrote, I don't think I have it right here. His first book was something called Bringing Nature Home, which is now required reading for Master Gardener interns before they get to the Penn State Master Gardener Training Manual. Everybody has to read Bringing Nature Home. Doug talked at Berkshire Botanical Gardens Rooted in Place conference, I think 3 years ago, maybe. Was one of the last ones that were in person before COVID hit. And I got permission from him to use this slide, and he talks about it, our garden design, as being sort of a teeter-totter or seesaw, where we need to balance the decorative value of the plants and trees that we select for our lawns and our gardens. We need to balance that with the food web value. For the past 50 or 100 years, it has been the decorative value has far outweighed the food web value. And because of that, we pretty much no longer have chestnut trees, and we have, a loss of native trees and native species because we've brought in plants not thinking that they would bring parasites or viruses or other pathogens, and they have. And whether it's wiping out other trees or wiping out insects because of fragmentation and not having the native plants that they absolutely need. And so this is something that I keep in the back of my mind all the time when I'm working with clients to select things for their properties. I'm not a purist. I don't think it's a good way to work with clients. People will always want, from an aesthetic value, people will have something that they just really love. And if they really love a certain plant and it's not native and it doesn't really contribute, that's great. That will become part of the 10%. How do we offset that with the 90% of native plants that we choose for the rest of the properties and the rest of the gardens? Native plants, I always want to throw this in because there's a lot of misinformation out there. There are people out there saying, I see them on Instagram all the time and Facebook saying plant native plants, you don't have to water them, you just put them in and they're native, and so they'll be fine, they're really great. And what that sets up is unrealistic expectations of what native plants will do. Native plants still need to be in the right place, right plant in the right place. We have native plants that prefer shade. We have native plants that prefer sun. Some need different kinds of soil. Others need different kinds of moisture. So you still need to get to know what a plant is and understand what your soil is and your property is before you plant them, even if they're native. They still need to be watered, and they still need to be cared for until they're established. One of the reasons I love getting people to plant seeds in the fall is that planting native seeds or using things like dill and fennel and rue and parsley as ornamentals is plant the seeds now, because the seeds will naturally go through their cold cycle, the stratification cycle that they need, and they will not really stop, not go 100% dormant like all seeds, all native seeds, native plant seeds during the winter, and they will actually be better adapted and not need as much water. They still need to have the right sunlight and the right type of soil. But seeds are great. It's much more challenging to put in plants, full plants, in the spring or the summer, and try to get them to grow and to thrive without watering them and without taking care of them. Big thing is that even native plants need to be sourced from trusted growers who do not use neonics or other synthetic pesticides. There was a study that came out about 2 months ago, and I've not sent it out a lot because I don't want to hit people over the head with it, but it was a study that was done by a university, and they were looking at, and some independent researchers, they were looking at just milkweed that was being sold in garden centers. And it was being touted as clean and I think the phrase everybody likes to use is attracts pollinators, attracts monarchs. And what they found was that every single sample of milkweed that they analyzed had 60 or more pesticides and pesticide residue in them. None of them were clean. And so people are thinking that this is really great to plant milkweed and or native plants, and they're going to sort of a generic garden center and thinking that the plants that they're planting are helping, and in fact they're hurting. And I think we're really lucky here in Western Mass. You'll see at the end I have a group of just a sort of a list of small native plant growers. We're really lucky to have them, and all of them grow clean plants. Before COVID at the Northampton Community Garden, we experimented for a couple of years, and I hope we can bring it back, something called the Clean Plant Sale. And rather than having gardeners drive 250 gardeners drive to all these native plant nurseries and great local growers, we thought, why don't we bring the growers to us? And it was a really nice thing to be able to do. We had the Conway School there and Nasami Farm there, and a couple of from Native Plant Trust, and a couple of other growers who I will show you here. But they're really, really wonderful, very dedicated, and you can absolutely get clean native plants from them. So we live in a really great place for things like that. And another thing is even as you're planting now for the fall, for things that will come up in the spring, design with all the properties of the native plants that you're buying in mind, even if it's seeds. People get surprised when, and I get surprised sometimes too, when native plants are competing, how tall they'll get. I mean, I actually had Asclepias tuberosa, which is the orange, it's called butterfly weed, but it's a milkweed. And I'm used to seeing it maybe 2 feet tall as a shrub. In West Springfield at the property where some of it seeded itself, it ended up being about 5 feet tall, which I've never seen before because it was competing with asters and goldenrod. So take all of that into mind when you're planting things, because you want it to be aesthetically pleasing, not just looking like a meadow necessarily, where it's a front yard and you don't really want a meadow in your front yard. So it takes just as much education and just as much research to work with native plants as it does to work with the plants that the cultivated plants that you buy. But it's worth the time, and it's worth the effort. So just to give you sort of a palette of plants and colors, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about what some of these plants are. But these are from my gardens at the Northampton Community Garden, and these are the plants that are for late spring and early summer gardens. There's swamp milkweed and dill and golden Alexander, Monarda fistulosa, borage, and you can see obviously milkweed with a monarch caterpillar in the lower left, and that's a spicebush swallowtail caterpillar on spicebush on the far right. Late summer, same garden with Joe Pye weed. I really like working with Tithonia, which is the orange Mexican sunflower. Echinacea, I plant a lot, and that's been a great plant and really popular with both butterflies, bees, and even hummingbirds. Rudbeckia, mint, again, swamp milkweed, Verbena bonariensis. I experiment with things, these gardens, initially I had paths through them so people could walk through, and I found that people were sort of walking through and trampling things in the name of taking pictures. And the real reason for planting these is to give pollinators and birds at the garden a place to feed. And also with clients, I will walk, take sort of little trips there so that people can see what these plants will look like as they mature. So my plots now I have two that are in their fifth. This was their fifth year, and I have one that was in it. This was its fourth year, and then a newer one that was its third year. And it's really interesting to see how the plants grow and mature and change. And so I'm hoping that there'll be sort of resources for people to say, okay, that's how big this cutleaf Rudbeckia will get. So if I'm going to plant it at my house, here's where I'll put it. I'll put it in the back row rather than in the front. But this is what late summer looks like. And here's late summer, early fall, which is what it looks like now. The tall yellow leaning flower is cutleaf Rudbeckia, which is a native. There's Verbena, and a lot of the, you can see I put red zinnia in there. I have, I think, 5 species of goldenrod, 4 or 5 species of asters in there, and a number of other things. But it still is, even though there are way fewer flowers than there are in the summer, in the full summer and late spring, there still are tons of butterflies and birds in there. The lower right in the back is New York ironweed, which I am experimenting with cutting it back in the spring so that it blooms a little bit lower and it doesn't get quite as big. But those are gorgeous plants as well. And again, bringing this around to where we are talking about fall and what we're planting for fall. These are those same gardens in the fall with berries popping up, the seed heads from anise hyssop, some of the alliums. There's goldenrod there, the Monarda fistulosa, and I have a chokecherry, and you can see chrysalis for black swallowtail and praying mantis in the upper left. These gardens, people say, oh, the garden is dead, there's nothing in there. Clearly they're not. And both from a birder's point of view and from an entomologist's point of view, all the seeds there are really important. There are just as many birds in my plots when the seed heads are like this as there are when I have sunflowers, or somebody next to me has sunflowers, and the goldfinches are going crazy eating all the seeds. There's still just tons of bird life in the garden.
Lari, we have another question that came through. What is the second from the left on the second row on that slide that you had?
This slide?
Yeah.
And tell me again, which one?
What is the second from the left on the second row? What is that?
It is grass, and I'm forgetting what the name of it is. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous grass that is low growing. It's not quackgrass. I'll look it up and I'll email you and tell you what it is. They're absolutely glorious seed heads. I work a lot with grasses, and I don't think I have any here in West Springfield. I was trying to figure out what to plant along the edge of the gardens there because they border Riverdale Street. And so salty, dirty, exhaust, just roadside chemicals. And I ended up by talking to a couple of people at an Asami farm, and they suggested, I was asking about beach grass, like the beach grass that we see on the dunes at the Cape. And so I bought it. I bought some, and it has thrived. It has done amazingly well, and it creates a kind of a great border to sort of keep humans from coming into the gardens there and picking things. And I also find grasses, I keep finding butterflies once they've come out of chrysalis and they need a place to dry their wings, hanging from the grasses and drying their wings. But I'll look, I can't remember what this is, but I'll look on my plant list and I'll send you the common name and the botanical Latin name as well.
All right, very good. That question was from Donna.
Okay, I'll get that and I'll send it to you, Janice.
Sounds good.
And here is a winter again and early spring. You can see chickadees and robins and a bluebird. The bluebird on the far right in the center is back way behind the airport here in Northampton along the river, the Connecticut River. You can tell, you can see the icebergs back there. It was really brutally cold, and they were feeding on staghorn sumac. The cedar waxwings are always fascinating to watch when they come in and clean out sometimes crab apples. They cleaned out one at Smith, I forget what it was. It was a canopy level tree, and I can't remember what it was, but really fascinating to watch. You can see grasses too. Really interesting. Amy Pulley at Wing and a Prayer Nursery tells some great sort of stories about how goldfinches and some of the other birds, how they're able to sort of ride the other plants to get to seeds on grasses, but how important the grass seeds are for their diet. And then in the bottom row, second from the right, is a queen bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. And she had been, obviously she's there in leaf litter. It's also at one of my garden neighbors at the Northampton Community Garden. And she came out on a sunny day in the winter, I think 3 years ago, just to sit there, and then when I watched her crawl back down again. I didn't dig anything up, but it's fascinating to realize where they are and how many of them there are. And again, that's one of my plots, N11, which is right next to Tom Gagnon's plot there on the left, next to the red cedar tree, looking dormant and pretty much dormant for the winter, but still filled with life. So plant selection right now for the fall, the most important thing, if you listen to Rob Jagir, one of the things that he will tell you, probably the most important tree family is willow or salix. And not to get, people get afraid of willows because they need water, they get really big, they're massive trees. Plant pussy willows. The thing about pussy willows is that, and willows in general, is that they are almost always, 99% of the time, the earliest flowering tree in the winter that's native and that has accessible nectar and pollen. I love taking people for walks around the Smith campus. There are some witch hazels there. There's one, it's a cultivar, it's Rochester, and it's a beautiful orange, and it blooms in January, which is crazy, but it's great to see something blooming in January. But there's never anything on it. I never see early emerging queen bumblebees or anything on it because it's not native, so it doesn't have that relationship with them. But aesthetically, it's lovely. So, I appreciate it. But pussy willows, the challenge right now, as always, but particularly now with such extreme shifts in our climate, are that when the bumblebees in particular come out, and you'll sometimes see honeybees too. I have a bunch of photographs of them, but the bumblebees come out, and the queen is pregnant, and she's really desperate to eat and to forage. And right now there aren't necessarily a lot of things out, so the timing is off between when things are beginning to bloom and when the bees are coming out and needing to eat. Obviously, if they can't eat, they die, and so we lose them. And so one of the things that we planted up at the garden that Dr. Jagir came in, and I'll give you a willow nursery in Vermont as a reference, are just branches of pussy willow. They grow pretty quickly, don't need a lot of care, and they don't get really big. And so they're great to have in a backyard, or great to have in a side yard or a meadow. Again, we don't allow big trees at the community garden, but people have shrubs, and so we treat these as shrubs and just stop them from being over 6 feet tall, and they bloom, and they're a great source of food for early emerging native bees, particularly bumblebees. For things that bloom in the early spring, wild violets. People love to hate violets, but violets are the primary host of the fritillary butterfly family. Self-heal, which is Prunella vulgaris, people, I talk with people often. I use Creeping Charlie, which most people pull out. I use it as a ground cover and a permanent green mulch in my plots at the garden. It covers the ground enough so that I don't have as many plants self-seeding, but what it does do is it blooms early in the winter, low to the ground. There's tiny little purple flowers, and I always find bees on it. So Dr. Jagir, we have planted Prunella in his plots, and I've been experimenting with Prunella and also Creeping Charlie, which is ground ivy. The others you probably know: low bush blueberry, beard tongue. The penstemons are really, really gorgeous. There are some that are red leaf, some are green leafed, and they're early bloomers, and they self-seed really, really wonderfully. Rudigraviolens is common rue, which is a preferred host plant for giant swallowtail butterflies in particular. And really an easy to grow, great addition to the garden. Some of these things too, I mean, these are host plants, and that's really what I'm talking about as much as foraging plants. And so it has to be a balance of all of them. Bronze fennel, from the talk that we did at the garden a couple of weeks ago, I have bronze fennel seeds for people, dill seeds for people, and parsley seeds for people. They're great. All of them are edible, but they're great to plant as ornamentals, and each of them are host plants for a couple of different species in the swallowtail family. For summer, spicebush, Lindera benzoin is a spicebush swallowtail. Winterberry, anything in the ilex family, plant them early so that they'll begin to do berries as birders. These are host plants, and they serve sort of a dual purpose in that they are host plants, but they also, through their berries, feed birds throughout the year. The milkweeds that are here, butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, which is the orange one, common milkweed you all know, swamp milkweed, which is a really beautiful pink milkweed that doesn't take over a garden, really stays in place, and it's done well in both more rural and very urban settings for me. Hoary skullcap, Scutellaria incana, is also one of my favorite plants that I learned about with a plot that I took over 3 years ago. And it's been a primary feeding source for the bombus, the bumblebee that is sort of skittering on being on the endangered species next, Bombus viridis. But it's a gorgeous blue colored flower that flowers in August and early September, and even the seed pods are gorgeous. Goldenrod, the whole goldenrod family is, I forget how many of them, there are many, and they can be thuggy, but they're also major host plants and major contributors. And so I'll show you, that's actually more of a color close-up picture of one of my plots. It's cut leaf, Rudbeckia in the front, and New York ironweed in the back. And then to the left, the seed heads are Monarda fistulosa, which is our native bee balm. Doug Ptolemy, who I mentioned, I always mention, he is just such a tremendous resource. Bringing Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope, and he has his latest book out is about oaks and oak trees and how critical they are. He also started something called Homegrown National Park, which is Doug's effort to get people. I think we have 46 million acres of backyards, and he feels that we have a better shot of bringing more native plants back into play for insects and birds if we do them in our backyard rather than waiting for governments to do it. But I'll send you links to some of his talks on YouTube. He's very funny and really fascinating to listen to. These are, I won't go into all of these. I'll send you this list. Winging a Prayer Nurseries, Amy Pulley in Cummington. I think Amy is still open. She generally opens late. She generally doesn't have plants available until early June. As far as I know, she's still open. That's a Plenty Farm, Kathy and Michael Katz in Hadley. I don't know if they're still open. I don't think they are. I know Bare Roots Farm is not. Bare Roots Farm is interesting. Anna and Chris don't grow native plants, but they do grow clean and organic vegetables. And so the zinnia that I buy and the tithonia that I buy and the Verbena bonariensis, I just contract order from them. I trust they're growing. Their plants are always fabulously healthy. And for anything that's not native, and all the vegetables in my garden are from them as well. Nasami Farm, Native Plant Trust. I think they're closed now. They opened in April. You know, with Nasami, they have new people. There was sort of a regime change there a few years ago. Uli Lormer is with them now. His book on native plants is fabulous. It just came out this year. And they're doing more and more of their own propagation and seed collecting. And so I've leaned on them a lot for different projects. The Vermont Willow Nursery is really interesting. I don't know what their hours are right now, but they're great growers and really knowledgeable. It's not that far away, and I would talk with them. We have some of the willows that we have at the garden are from them with Dr. Jagir. Healy Native Plant Nursery. I don't usually drive out to West Stockbridge, but these folks are great. And if you are watching this, even though it's the Hampshire group, if you're watching from the Berkshires, Healy is also a great source. And now I'm happy to answer any other questions that anyone has, or if there are things that I didn't cover that you have questions about, or anything that you want more information about, please ask.
So let's not be shy here. Here's your opportunity to ask your question. You can just, there's a small group of us, so I'm suggesting you unmute your mic or raise your hand so we know you're next, and go for it. Or did Larry fill you up with so much you don't know where to begin?
Thank you, Susan.
I have a question. I don't know if I
Go
can.
for it.
Okay. I'm just wondering about converting your traditional lawn to support pollinators so that you have the broadleafs and so forth. And how would you suggest to get started with that?
Depends how brave you are. It depends where you live.
Suburb, street neighborhood, half-acre lots.
What are your neighbors like, and do you care?
Everybody has a nice lawn.
I guess that, it depends on who you are, and it depends if you have someone come in and do it. If it depends on a lot of things, but I would probably start it piece by piece. I probably would start by, do you have sort of flower gardens on the property?
Yes.
So what I usually recommend that people do to help get used to it and get your neighbors used to it is begin converting those gardens to more native plants, which doesn't have any negative bearing on the aesthetics of it. It's not like it's going to look, people will say, oh, you know, it's all weeds. We have gorgeous native plants. I mean, if you walked at the community garden with me, even now, there are plots that are, yes, things are beginning to die back because we're slowly coming down to the killing frost. But they're beautiful. Asters at this time of the year are absolutely stunning. And even the goldenrods, my favorite goldenrod is Solidago rugosa, which is called, the common name is fireworks. And it's just really very architectural, with like thin stems. And then it's called fireworks because it bursts on top with these really light stems of tiny yellow flowers. So if you get to know your native plants for, you know, your particular property, you know, sun patterns and water and soil, and begin integrating native plants that will support pollinators into your regular flower gardens, trees and shrubs as well. And then if you do that the first year, then begin expanding that garden and decide, what do you want your lawn to be? Do you want paths to go through it? You know, some people have sort of created paths so they can walk through them, so it looks almost more like a formal garden. Some people have put in raised beds once they got so inspired about having native plant gardens there. And there are all kinds of things that you can do with native plants too. I didn't put it in this this presentation, but a great book is called Planting in a Post-Wild World by Tom Rayner and Claudia West. I'll send you a link to it. I think it came out in 2016, and it gives you some really great information about using a traditional structure for designing a garden, but using native plants. And I have just found it to be a really useful book, and I usually recommend it, but you might get that book. Most libraries have it. So you might get that book out of the library and begin thinking about how you would adapt using that kind of structure. What they do, Claudia is from East Germany, and she studied with, I can't remember his name, but very well-known East German landscape architect and designer. And just the idea that there's a structural element. So like there always are shrubs or trees, lower, not canopy trees, but lower trees in a garden. And so they're the backdrop or the edge. There's the sort of the center area, which are the more seasonal pieces. So things that might be the height of echinacea, where colors come and go and shapes come and go. And then there's the ground cover that's always in place to make sure that the soil has nutrients that are breaking down and that it maintains moisture. Or if you're a container gardener, the same kind of thing is there's always the thriller, which is the tall piece, the filler, which is what fills in the center, and the spiller, which are the sort of the ivy-like things that drape over the side. Same idea, but used in designing what a garden would be.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a question, Larry.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that we can do in the winter to help our gardens and to avoid causing damage that sometimes we see in the spring?
From,
say, burning or anything like that, you know, like some people will use, you know, salt or things to that nature. Do you have any recommendations that we can be on the lookout or avoid, so we could be in better shape for the spring?
yeah, you know, a big thing is water. And it's not so much, I mean, you can certainly do it now, but the more we adequately water our plants, our trees, shrubs, and just plants in general throughout the year, it better prepares them. Their roots are healthier, their roots are deeper, their roots are just the foundation of them. And so the better they go into the winter, the healthier they go into the winter, the better they'll be able to resist things like like salt, or like these, you know, a couple of years ago, we had really awful, dry, cold weather. It decimated a lot of the great old rhododendrons here in Northampton. And, you know, just preparing them, really taking care of them throughout the year will help with that. If you, because we're already here, you know, keep watering them. Right now, we seem to be getting a pretty good amount of rain. I don't know that all of us are still in drought. If we are, I'm guessing it's mild. Put down mulch or ground cover, a great thing to do. You know, when leaves first come down, more and more people are mowing them and mow them to break them up, and then either leave them on your grass or leave them, use them as mulch around the base of your trees and the base of your shrubs and plants. They'll break down as they do anyway. You're not killing anything at that point because nothing has attached itself. It's not, you know, when they first fall, they're not really leaf litter. So use them as nature uses them, which is they break down as part of the life cycle too and add nutrients to the soil. But
Right.
moisture is a really big thing. I talk a lot with them because the Northampton Community Garden is part of the city. I interact a lot with the DPW, and Rich Carasolidi is the tree superintendent for the city. And he's been a really great source of information. I was asking him about trees here, some of the trees here on our street, and big old specimen trees. And he said, trees really remember droughts from like 2 and 3 years ago. They hold that information in their roots and in their systems. And so we have to think, when we think about trees in particular, we have to think that long. There also are, we have a big old sugar maple here at the house. It's probably about 125 years old. I've talked to a few arborists about it, and they're talking about, Dave Cotton from Cotton Trees talking about research that he's doing, particularly on sugar maples, and that the older ones are having trouble adapting to sort of the new temperature ranges. The younger ones seem to be adapting more quickly. So keep an eye on your trees, bigger trees like that, because they sometimes it seems like it's worse for them in the summer when the drought is happening, but oftentimes it will be in the winter when they're so depleted that the cold really gets in and sort of begins to kill them or does kill them.
Okay, very
Is that
good.
helpful?
Yes, absolutely. Larry, we have some more questions that came in through the chat. Paul's asking, what is the species name of your fireworks goldenrod?
It's Solidago rugosa. So I'll send you a link to it. And it's RUGOSA, Solidago rugosa. And it's just an exquisite. It spreads by itself, but it's not thuggy, meaning that, you know, it's not covered. The early goldenrod and wrinkle leaf goldenrod can sometimes grow too much and too fast, but fireworks is really lovely, and it's really delicate. It gets about shoulder tall.
Okay, very good. And we have another question that came through chat. Juliana is asking, what do you recommend for the leaves on the lawn in the fall?
You know, there are a lot of things to do. Some people, more and more sort of people who manage lawns but do it in a more sustainable way, are suggesting that you do what I suggested a few minutes ago, which is use your mower and mow them, and to shred them and to break them up, and leave, depending on how much you can handle and depending on the kind of grass you have, leave some of them on the grass because they will add nutrients to the grass and will just break down and actually help the grass. If you can bring things out earlier, compost, you know, at the community garden and here at the house, I know we do a lot of composting. We use as many leaves as we can. We break them down, we do mow them, and then put them on the compost pile, mix them with, we do have a small backyard here too, and we mix the grass with the leaves and things out of the garden. We actually have a 2 compost system, things that are like food scraps and things from the kitchen. I sort of compost those in a black composter and then add them to the outside pile. Begin composting more. You know, nature has a way of breaking down all the plants just as part of the natural cycle. We just have gotten away from it because we look at them as being more cumbersome, but it's such a waste to take all these leaves and put them into bags and have the city or whoever take them away and dump them somewhere. So compost, more and more people are doing urban compost. Some people, when I do talks, people worry about the smell of compost. As long as you're not putting things like meat or bones or anything like that in the compost, they're not really smelly. I mean, it's just leaves and plants breaking down.
Julianne, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, okay. I can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I put that because I was regarding the leaves, I had written that as you were explaining the thing about breaking them down. But I live in an area where there's a lot of trees, a lot of woods around here. And but I still have lawn, and I kind of want to keep the lawn there for, I'm not ready to do like a meadow or whatever like that
Yeah.
or whatever. But I kind of understood that the leaves, I was concerned about breaking them up because I thought, aren't there something like larvae and stuff that put themselves on the leaves? I was concerned about that, of damage to that. And then when you take a lot of leaves, when they're in the forest or whatever, you have a certain thickness, the layer of the
Yep.
leaves. And if I take my leaves and then throw them into the forest into a huge pile or whatever, because I'm composting them, right?
Yep.
If there's larvae, so there's a situation where if there's like larvae or whatever it is, eggs on those leaves, that I'm now, they're not in a place where they should have been. They're too deep under or whatever. And the other thing is that oh, what was my other question? Well, I can't remember what I was going to say about. Oh, and also leaving the leaves. I mean, I know in the forest, like when I move them, there's kind of a habitat under the leaves type of thing.
Absolutely.
So when I move them, I've been leaving them on my flower beds, but I've been taking them off the leaves because taking them off the lawn because what happens, I just get moss.
Right.
And so that was what I was wondering about with the leaves. I mean, I could say there's enough leaves in the woods, so I don't have to worry about, what's on my lawn. You know what I mean? It's just one small part of, because there's a lot of woods behind the house too, so.
Yeah. I think there's not one answer. Part of it is cultural. Part of it is what you like aesthetically. Are there things on the leaves? There are. For the most part, they're not eggs or chrysalis at this time of the year. There always are some. But I would, if you have, woods around you, use a blower and, blow them into the woods, not all in one pile, but spread them out as much as you can. I know there are places that hate blowers and towns that are doing ordinances against blowers. I find them less damaging than things like raking. And also sometimes if you have a big property, you're not going to stand out there and hand rake things. And so if you can move them off your grass, if you could mow some of them and use it to mulch your grass, great. Take the rest of them and just move them into the woods or create compost piles and let them break down. For compost, I mean, if there are chrysalis in there, if there are eggs in there, it's part of composting is part of a normal process. Most of them will make it and most of them should be fine. It's more about, when we rake up leaves and we see, all these people, most of the guys, I always say, these guys driving around with trucks filled with leaves in the back, and either they get burned or they go to a dump somewhere, or lucky for any of us who are in towns and cities that have town compost. But use them. It's like giving away money. It's compost we all need. We can all do compost in our backyards, whether it's big or it's little, and just go step by step. Don't try to do it all at once. And see how it works for you. What happens in the wood too is that the ecosystem is there in there is really different than it is in our yards. And the grasses that we have in our yards are not really, they wouldn't grow in the woods. And so it's a different kind of system. And so you just have to sort of figure out, also depends on how much moisture you get and what kind of soil it is. sometimes when you're so close to the woods, you're going to get moss anyway, because it's just the pH of the soil and how the soil is made up. So it's different. There's not one answer. But I'm big on do things step by step. Don't beat yourself up. Just begin and test it and see how it works. And what works this year, great, do it more. What doesn't work, change it. Does that help?
Larry, we have a couple of more questions real quick. What's your feeling about pokeweed? The birds love it, but it takes over. It's not considered invasive and not native.
Yeah, you know, it's a fascinating plant, and I'd love to photograph the flowers. The birds do love it. I don't find that it takes over. I am concerned more from at the community garden in particular. I'm more concerned about, we have a lot of children in the garden, and so pokeweed is somewhat poisonous. And so, you know, I think it's a gorgeous plant. I think it just depends where it is. I wouldn't particularly grow it. It does take over, but it's pretty easy to cut down as well. Birds love it for sure. For sure.
Right. And then Amy's asking, I know we aim for less lawn, but can you recommend any lawn care services who understand best practices and organic lawn care?
You know, I really don't know any off the top of my head. A lot of them are, I'm sure they're out there. You know, I watch people, you know, who use electric mowers and people who use non-synthetic chemicals. I think the emphasis really has to be, why do we need lawns, and can we reduce them as much as possible? And what are we really hoping for? Somebody, I forget who it was talking about creating lawns with clover, lawns with, like, what is lawn? For most people, you know, is it a particular kind of grass, or is it like a lot of lawns, there's a lot of crabgrass and just green stuff? And I think we have to redefine what lawns are. I don't know anybody that does a really great job on sustainable lawn care or organic lawn care, at least here, that I've felt have done a good job. You know, most people want to just figure out what grass seed to put down in the soil that they have, and I think it has to start deeper than that. I think we have to understand what the soil is first. You know, what's there. Do soil testing. We have great resources. UMass is a great resource. Their soil testing lab is terrific. It costs about $25. You know, their turf. They have a lot of funding from Bayer/Monsanto. The turf grass business is big for them. So I probably wouldn't look to them for that, but begin by understanding your soil and what kind of soil you have, and then grow from there and decide what you want to have for a lawn and what you want that lawn to be.
All right, that's all we have for the questions I could see on chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Yes,
so much.
thank you, Larry.
Always
And
my pleasure.
well, we love having you. So, you know, think about next year. So for all of you, we'll be, you'll see the video of this will be on our website, and tomorrow or the next day, whenever Larry gets this out to us, all the resources, we will mail each of you a copy of those. So thank you very much for attending, and we're delighted to have those of you from the other bird clubs. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
job.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay,
Take care.
bye-bye.
Thank you.